morning, everybody. So how was that first talk? I sadly had to miss it, but I'm really looking forward to the videos, and then I can watch that talk as well. So again, there we go. There's the first slide. So what I want to talk about today is the history of Swift and how we take things for granted and how we assume that things that are there are just there and we can use them. And oftentimes it's not that straightforward, and it's actually really good to think about how something came to be. So that's how I want to approach the history of Swift and explain that all the features that we have right now in Swift might not have been there and might also not be something that you can take for granted. And obviously, this is not something that only applies to Swift, but obviously also to programming in general, and even life in general. Like, don't think that everything you have is just there. It came to be, and there's hard work going into that, and we should be happy with that. So I want to take a tour through Swift from even before it was announced at WWDC in 2014. Before I do that, I want to ask you all a question. Who started Swift with Swift 1? That's quite a few people. And what about later when Swift 2 came around or when it was open sourced? And who even joined even later, like Swift 3 or whatever? All right, then I got a really interesting things in store for you. So let's see how it all came to be. So more than 8 years ago, actually, someone named Chris Latner, who you might know or not, started with a project called Swift. And it just started with a super simple hello world, as everything does. And think about it, like it's already 8 years ago. That's quite a bit of time. But let's see. So we started not with Git, but we started with SVN, something I think even Xcode is dropping at this point. And the whole project was just internal at Apple, and it was secretive, and nobody knew about it, and it was also just Chris that started on the project, as you can see, where he did a lot of stuff before any other people at Apple joined. So I want to go through the history, and I want to build up from the start. And the start is that point in time where the people at Apple were working on Swift even before it was announced, and what the features were that they worked on, and what the things were that are now super obvious to us, but might not have been really obvious before. So we start on July 10th, 2013, and we have 327 days left until the announcement at WWDC. So it's a bit less than a year. And what we saw is, or what they worked on at that point is, Nil was an NS object. And that's a scary thing at this point because, NS object is Objective-C, it's not Swift. And, Nil doesn't make sense as an object because it's nothing. But this is how it started. So at this point, they changed it, and it picks up the object type. So you don't have to cast any nils to whatever type of that nullable type it was, but it was just the object that you're referencing. In this case, this one being the NS string, and you can set it to nil. And that's something that's really obvious at this point, but it wasn't there before. No optionals, nothing. So we go a bit further, about a week further, and this is something I was really interested in seeing, that they worked on this so early. Switches on just more than integers. I think many of us that are working also with Objective-C know that it's pretty tricky to work with switches in Objective-C if you're used to them in Swift, because you can switch on anything. You can switch on a struct, you can switch on a tuple, you can switch on strings, on anything. But in Objective-C, and before this also in Swift, you could also you could only switch on an integer. Something interesting that you might be able to see is at the bottom case, you have this dot dot syntax. And please remember this, because some of us that started with Swift 1 might remember this. But at this point in the history of Swift, it was actually something different, or it meant something different. All right, 306 days left. And we have underscores in literals. And I see a lot of code. And from time to time, I see these large numbers or these large constants. And they are like this big number. And I'm like, what is this number? And that's why they introduced the underscores in Swift, where you can really easily see what a number is. And you cannot only use it for integers. You can also use it for this hex code. And it just makes it a lot easier to give the intent to other people of what you're trying to express. It's super simple, but at the same time also super powerful. And it's like I said, it's often like unused or people don't know about it. So another week later, and we're talking about weak and unowned variables. And think about this. Like, we've all seen this memory leak and this bug where the app crashes at some point unreliably. And that would be like, that's what would happen if we don't have weak and unowned and being able to like break the reference cycles and be able to like free objects. So at this point, they introduced weak and unowned. But as we can see, they still had this weird bracket syntax, which is not something we have seen even from Swift 1. So this is something that they will change before they announce Swift 1. But it's a really, like, again, a really small but really impactful thing. We go a bit further, and this is not, is it Swift or is it Java? I'm not so sure. Because before it was Java, and now it's becoming more Swifty because they changed this to self. And it's not a big deal, and it's just a stylistic change. But it's interesting to see how like we grow from the start to what we're used to right now. Going a bit further, we're talking about unions. And if you look at it, it looks not like a union, it looks like an enum. And you would be right, because it is an enum. But at this point, it was called a union. And also, really interestingly, we already have associated values here. So you can see we have a case A that has an associated value of string. We even have this image with multiple associated values. And we have this break line without any associated values. And you can use them just like you do today. We already have some type inference there. And it's really interesting to see. Also, for those people that didn't start until Swift 3, we can see that we are still using capitalization for these enum values, which is something we don't do anymore today. And this is another thing that I've seen like being unused. But before this, you had to always initialize a value or a variable to some initial value. So an integer would be 0, or a Boolean would be false, or a string would be an empty string. But what this allows is to tell to the compiler as well, is like, hey, we want to put an integer in this variable. And we do this if-else, which means that in any of these cases, this variable will be set. And you are allowed to do that. So again, this makes the intent of what you want to do clearer. And it prevents those mistakes of like, hey, why do we set it to 0 and then change it right after? Going further, and we're looking at some weird constructors. When I saw this, I was like, this looks like more like Objective-C, right? Because we have this init with year, and then with the external parameter, and this place with the external parameter. So this is something they before also was called a constructor and not an init. And funnily enough, that change in naming was to have some more overlap with Objective-C. But we'll also see that this whole structure of calling a function will change, and also how you write this function will change. Here we have something really, really interesting, which is a generic union. So again, in Enum, with with a single payload, so with a one generic parameter. And some of you might already think, like, hey, what does this allow us to do? And this is something that we will see, because obviously that's optional of type T. So at this point in the Swift language, there was optional. And before this, there wasn't really. There was this really weird using of nil that we've seen. So here we see actually that optional T was born. Second thing that they also changed is that a weak variable must always be optional, because that's the nature of weak. At some point when it gets deallocated, it will turn to nil, and it doesn't make sense not to have it nullable. Going a bit further, and we're looking at in-out. And this was, again, something that had a different name. It was called byref. And this allows you to pass in a pointer, just like we're used to do in Objective-C, and then change that pointer within the function. So as we see right here, we have this variable x, we pass it in, and it is changing and mutated within that function. Second thing is optional chaining. So before, we didn't have optional chaining. You couldn't use this question mark operator to go through a list of variables that each were optional, and at the end get the, either the result or a nil. And the reason for that as well was that they, that, as we see right here, is that this ternary operator where you have like, if x is true, then use y, or otherwise use z. And before, they didn't, you didn't need this spacing around the question mark. And since this was enforced here, that allowed them to use this optional question mark at the end of a variable, and that allowed them to introduce optional chaining. As well, what they introduced is that you can ignore a certain parameter or variable, which in this case we have an HTTP status, which has a number and a reason, but we can like ignore that number to indicate that we're not using this. Then we're looking at enums with raw types. So at this point, we have an enum instead of a union. And we have raw types, like we have in Objective-C, we have an integer again, and that's where it stops. And now in Swift, we have strings, and we have characters, and we have floating points. So again, you see this difference, where Swift offers a lot of more functionality here. But again, like this won't be usable from Objective-C. And for those of you that know, yes, I'm like strictly like putting all the strings behind the case, because this is not inferred at this point. We see later in Swift 2, we get the case being the string by default if you have a string raw type. So we go on, and it's only 22 days until Swift is announced. And there is this vector T type that's being rewritten. And I saw this and I was like, what is a vector T? And it's actually an array. So before this, we had a vector type, and now it's what we're used to. It's an array. There were some other optimizations here, like if you have a missing return for a non-void function, that would throw an error before that would not be caught. We can also use the switch pattern for matching structs and classes, which is really powerful and at the same time a bit weird that you're like creating new instances of a struct to switch on. But as we can see, that's a really powerful thing to do as well. And there's some really, like, I think this is something that people also really argue about, but they added trailing commas in dictionary and array literals, where you can add a comma to the latest object in the array or the dictionary, and the compiler will not complain. And what that's helpful for is that if you add the next element, you don't have to think about adding the comma again. And now I'm not talking about Swift anymore, because for some weird reason, they decided to change the func keyword to def. So, OK, it's either Ruby or Python, but it was like, what? Right, so it was func. They changed it to def. And then obviously later, they changed it back again. And so at this point, like, this is what Swift looked like. We use def. Now we're looking at only 201 days left. And we're looking at Enum Bridging and static properties. And Enum Bridging is something interesting where we were actually not able to bridge enums with an integer raw value in Objective-C to Swift. This was now changed. So we had this NSEnum to be able to do this conversion. And as we can see as well, is that it already drops part of the name in Objective-C where it's not as verbose and more Swifty. Next thing is that they added static properties for non-generic structs and enums. So before there was nothing static, and at this point they started introducing that for structs and enums. We're back to Swift. Luckily, it's func again. So now we know what we're looking at, and that's great. On the other hand, they also did some more improvements where if you return from a function or have any unreachable code, like the print statement, which was at that point still print ln, that will actually return a warning that this code will never be executed. There was also some overflow detection that was improved both in the runtime and the compiler, where if your integer would overflow, there would be better error messages. So it's coming up to December 2013, so it's almost Christmas. And Chris and his team were still working as hard on Swift as ever. And they introduced binary operator precedences. And that's something many people might not really think about, including me. But it's really useful. If you've done math and you're doing subtraction and multiplication, you have to think about the rules and how they should, like what to do first. And this is something that was introduced here. As well as that ID is now an any object is in Swift. And what it was called before was actually dynamic lookup. And that's interesting because that's something that's now brought up again, where we have this Python and Swift bridging that uses dynamic lookup. So we are actually like reintroduced to this thing. So these are, like I said before, these are the binary operator precedences. You can also use these in your custom operators, which is another great function of Swift. And then we have something where if you do a super.init in an initializer, before you initialize all the values, we will actually get also an error that will help you tell you that, hey, this needs to be initialized, otherwise we can't really deal with this struct. So now it's actually Christmas, and actually on Christmas somebody worked on Swift, and they introduced something great, because they introduced map for arrays. And at least for me, this whole functional programming of map and reduce and filter is something that I had a really hard time understanding. But once that clicked, I think that's the one function that I can't do without. There was even a Merry Christmas in the changelog at that point. Another few weird name changes where static was changed to type, and there was this whole discussion around why they did that. And obviously, like we know, we don't have type anymore, so they changed it back again. But they changed it to type to have it less misleading at that point is what they thought. And we see another thing, which is init delegation. So we can actually have these, what we now are used to as convenience initializer, where we can pass one initializer with whatever default value and just use, like, call the other initializer. 131 days left, and we get immutability. So before we didn't have any let or any immutability, and now we are starting to get immutability on value types, which is, I think, a really, really big thing in Swift at this point. Then we get will set and did set for to observe properties, which is something that will also change from this this syntax, but it was something that was introduced, and I think many of us use it every single day. We get some conditional variable binding, so an if-let, which wasn't there before. So this is also something we see every day and everywhere, where we check if a value is nil or not and handle accordingly. And that's a big thing. And then again, there was a small thing where we can actually now create an executable on the command line and create a Swift script that we can run later from the command line with this executable. So we're getting dangerously close, only 110 days left, so it's about 3 months or a bit more. And we get a new message syntax. And we get let that is renamed to val. So now we're talking about Kotlin, certainly. And there were some changes in range, and that's what I was talking about before, where you see that 1 with triple dot to 3 is actually only 1 and 2. And the other way around, 1 with a double dot is 1, 2, and 3. And this is obviously something that has also changed. At this point, this was to have consistency with Ruby, where before they had def and changed it back, so I didn't know what they were doing. We're changing type again, which was before was static, and now we have static and class, where you use static for any value type, so a struct or an enum, and you use class for, well, a class, so a reference type. So here we have override. And this is something that is not there in Objective-C, and it was introduced in Swift, where if you're overriding something, you have to explicitly tell people that you're overriding something, and it's really easy to see that you're overriding something. And we're back to let, so whew. We also got these compiler directives that have been like getting better and improving. So here we had the simple compiler directive where we can see if we have an OS 10 or an iOS that we're using and import something based on that or do something based on that. Now we get designated and convenience initializers. And this is something that I particularly myself feel that I should write a proposal because convenience initializers and designated initializers are really tricky. And I see, like I myself oftentimes see an error where it tells me you need to call the designated initializer. And at that point, I'm like, what designated initializer? I don't even know how to find out what the designated initializer is. So I really want to do something there, but I think that can still be improved. And we have some implicitly conforming types where our device type now conforms to equatable and hashable by default, which is something we much later in Swift 4 see that comes to more types. Now we have something that we also all know and use is these empty array and empty dictionary literals. Something small but really useful. Here we got a new call syntax, where before we had this NS color with red, space green, space blue, space alpha. And now we get this UI color with red, R, green, G, B, whatever. So this is what we're used to seeing today. And as well, we get final with @final at this point. We get a dictionary as a tuple, so we can actually loop through them, as we know right now, and actually get both the key and the value. We have some improved type checking at this point, about a month to go. We got floating point ranges, where before we could only use integers. And we get this new convenience initializer spelling, where we use convenience in it instead of like this returns self syntax. We got keywords in functions, and that is like strictly enforced at the call site, where you need to pass in the red and the green external parameters instead of like omitting them. So that makes Swift a lot more readable. Now we're getting dangerously close, and we're seeing something with dictionary returning an optional instead of trapping. And we have capture lists, where in a closure you can convert yourself or whatever is there to not like a weak object, so it might like not create a reference cycle. 10 days left, and we're getting filter and map on sequence, which is really amazing. And they add closures, so you can actually do your computation in a closure instead of passing in like whatever you need to do in the filter there. And then beta 1 was shipped, and we all know that was a curious time with source kit crashes, but at the same time also really interesting to start learning Swift and getting into the tooling. So it was almost release time, and there were some more changes, where we have the ... changed to ... smaller than to make it more readable. And that was a godsend, because it was so easy to overlook, like, are we using like small, like including, or like is it just 1 and 2 instead of 1, 2, 3? And they added sort to sort in place, or that was already there, but now it's sorting in place, and sorting returns a new sorted array. We got some changes to arrays and dictionaries that I didn't know weren't there in Swift when it was like beta 1 shipped. So we actually have this brackets around int instead of int open close brackets. And we have this dictionary instead of this dictionary with these generic types. And there was also a small improvement in how we print strings and string interpolation, where we need this special syntax with the braces to indicate that we're using a special number. We get access control. It wasn't there before. There was nothing. Everything was public. And now we got public and internal by default and private. And oh boy, if only it would have stayed this simple. We get Nil Coalescing, where if you have the left-hand side being nil, you add this question mark and have a default on the right-hand side. Or you can even chain it, where you have multiple potentially nil objects, and then the right-hand side will be used. And we can mutate through a question, like through an optional, where we can like check if it is there, like increase the number in this Fibonacci sequence, because obviously like 4 is not correct there. And then we have the release date. And there's something added that's called failable initializers, where your initializer can actually return nil. And that's awesome. They also changed with that the way how you get a raw value from an enum. So this is something I also really remember from using Swift 1, where you had this from raw and to raw. And now that just feels weird. Last but not least, I want to quickly go through like what we've seen in Swift 2, in Swift 3, and Swift 4, where in Swift 2 we get defer, we get add available, and hash available to do some compiler directives there to see if some version is available or not, and do something based on that. We get protocol extensions, and we get protocol default implementations. I think we all know Krusty and the famous presentation about that. We get throwing and catching, where before it was still like using the passing in of pointers from Objective-C. We get attestable, and we get something awesome that's called guard. Then we get Swift open sourced. We get add escaping, which before was the opposite, where it was non-escaping. We get never, where we return a type that actually never does anything and will crash the app, which is pretty useful. We get file private. That was later changed again. We get ID being any instead of any object, so now it's much easier to use value types. And we do a lot of renaming and a lot of errors as well. Swift 4 brought us keypads, conditional conformance, and codable. And I think codable is also something that's really, really interesting. And then with Swift 5, we're looking at ABI stability and string ergonomics. And after that, who knows what will come. But it's going to be a wild ride. And it's going to be awesome. And I think we're very lucky to have this amazing language and with this amazing community around it, both in what we have right here as well as in the people working at Apple. Thank you very much.